Good afternoon, my friends.
Good afternoon, sir.
All right, our resource.
Good afternoon, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon. Please mute yourself.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Please mute yourself. So our resource person, Shakila ma'am, has joined. Ma'am, there are few people in the queue. So just we will wait for 1 minute, then we will start.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. So I think let's start. Ma'am, should we start?
Yeah, I think we should start. They'll join as they come along.
Sure, ma'am. Sure. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shakila T. Shamsu. In fact, the OSD in the former OSD, in fact, of new education policy in the Department of Higher Education, Ministry of Education. So, Dr. Shakila, in fact, is a beautiful combination of academic caliber as well as administrative experiences. So, in fact, after spending sizable number of years at University of Mumbai and at Jamia Millia Islamia in teaching, in fact, she went to the Ministry of Education. At that time, it was MHRD, and where she took initiatives, lot of initiatives. If you see, there was one flagship program of Government of India that was a National Mission on Teachers and Teaching. Now it is known as Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya National Mission on Teachers and Teaching. Then another flagship program, new initiatives of leadership for academic programs, that is academician programs, that is LEAP. Ma'am started this. At that time, she was in the ministry. And ARPIT program, which is known as Annual Refresher Program in Teaching. Again, it was started under her tenure. So besides, she took so many initiatives as faculty induction programs and so many other initiatives. So she was also holding various positions such as OSD 12th plan in Ministry of Education, and she was also joint advisor in education in the Planning Commission. So basically, she holds PhD in education, has got gold medal for Masters of Political Science, PG diploma in distance education, and a degree in law. She has to her credit a number of articles in international journals, books contribution, and was involved in the preparation of 11th and 12th plan and several government reports on education. She has been a member of various committees of the Government of India, state governments, UGC, national selection committees for Fulbright fellowship, etc. So, in fact, this whole education policy basically was drafted under her able guidance. That's why I prefer to request her to come to my every program related to NEP, because no one is as authentic as ma'am herself on any aspect of NEP 2020. So this time we have selected one topic, academic leadership, for her. But I mean, on any topic, on several topics, I have invited and I have requested her, and she delivers excellently, beautifully, because she has drafted the whole National Education Policy 2020. So I think, my friends, we are fortunate that ma'am has given time to us, because it is very hectic. It's the holy month of Ramzan. And besides, it was very hectic. Even today, she was engaged somewhere else, but somehow she has got the time for us. So it's my humble request to all of you, please listen to her carefully, and not only listen, ma'am gives sufficient time for the discussion. So if you have any doubt, not only on the academic leadership, on any issue of NEP, on any aspect of NEP, so you can ask, ma'am gives sufficient time. Please utilize this opportunity and clear your doubts. So with this short introduction, in fact, after retirement, ma'am is not just retired. Rather, after retirement, she is more active. And I think there is not even a single day spared when she is not delivering any lecture like that. So there is one, in fact, non-governmental organization, very important one, that is Center for Public Policy Research. It is Kochi-based organization. It is basically a think tank, and it discusses on so many policies of the government of India. And in this think tank, in fact, ma'am looks after the matters of education. So with this short introduction, I'm handing over the session to ma'am. And one thing about my participants, ma'am, you will find them very interactive. They really want to learn, and all the resource person have praised for them. So I'm quite sure you will like their company, ma'am. So with this, it's over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sajid, and good afternoon to all the participants. I do look forward to the interaction. Since it's only a 1.5 hour session, normally I do it in a sandwich program where I have an interaction for the first 1 hour if it's a 3-hour session, and thereafter talk and give again another 40 minutes or half an hour for interaction. But since it's only 1.5 hours, I would just possibly try and ask, since you've been having this program for a few days before, if there is any particular aspect of NEP on which a couple of you would like to raise some thoughts or share your views on that, please feel free. Maybe I can take a couple of you and then delve into the topic of academic leadership, governance, and management. So please feel free. If one or two of you would like to talk any aspect of NEP, please go ahead.
Participants, it's a good opportunity. If you want to share something, or if you want to clarify any doubt related to any aspects of an NEP, ma'am is available for you. She is the first hand information of NEP 2020.
Please feel free to speak even in Hindi if you want. No one? Don't restrict yourself to academic leadership. Please talk on holistic and multidisciplinary education, or you can talk about internationalization of higher education. So many themes that we deal with in NEP, technology integration.
Rajput sir? Rajput sir, Dr. Talib Saab, you people, if you want to ask any question. Dr.
Nothing
Talib
like
Saab?
that, sir. Well, after listening the lecture, sir, we'll try to find
Okay.
out some.
Okay, you will prefer to ask after listening to her. Okay.
Okay.
Anybody else? Any other participant? Aman? Dr. Aman? I think,
Okay,
ma'am,
Sajid, I think
ask the
we'll
question
take
after
the...
listening to you.
Okay,
Yes,
that's
yes.
fine. That's fine. Okay, so let me try and come to the topic of academic leadership, governance, and management as per the aspects relating to NEP. But that really is not restricted to national education policy. It is more about the entire higher education landscape. And there are certain specific interventions that we have recommended in the NEP. But at the forefront, I think you must understand some general aspects of the national education policy as educators. And I'm sure you've been hearing many other speakers and resource persons explaining to you about what is holistic and multidisciplinary education, why there is a need to integrate technology into education, and so on. But you must firstly understand a rationale as to why NEP, in the way it has been laid out, makes out a very strong case for these kind of recommendations. In fact, the founding principle of NEP is that of flexibility. And why flexibility becomes imperative in the 21st century learning ecosystem is what you need to understand, because that is what then makes sense of the NEP recommendations. So to just a brief overview, or rather a rationale into understanding why the NEP's recommendations have strongly put forward a case for flexible pathways and multiple trajectories and flexibility in curricular choices and so on. And I'll then come on to the topic of academic leadership. Now, in the 21st century, in a learning environment or in an educational ecosystem, the main aspects relate to knowledge and learning. And these two aspects of knowledge and learning have completely changed from what it was in the previous century. And when you hear the previous century, it appears as if it is years back. But please understand, we as a generation are a unique generation having the benefit of having our education in the previous century, that is in the 20th century. And we are teaching students who have been born in the 21st century. And when you situate these two centuries, there have been certain changes, which is the reason why the national education policy in 2020 made a major shift and a transformation in the way it approached education. And that approach is one of flexibility, as I said. And that emanates from the fact that knowledge and learning in the 21st century have both become multidimensional. Knowledge is seen as not just information and not just silo-based disciplines, but being seen as being interconnected knowledge disciplines. So the idea that knowledge exists to the exclusion of other disciplines, or knowledge of a given discipline is existing to the exclusion of other disciplines, has completely gone away. Rather, we have now accepted that knowledge is an integration of several disciplines. And that is why when you hear the word that the world is moving towards becoming a knowledge economy or a knowledge society, the interconnectedness of knowledge disciplines results in the new notions that we talk about in education of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and so on. These terminologies were not very prominent in the 1970s or the 1980s and so on, because at that time, we thought disciplines existed in depth only in relation to their own intrinsic content and not with the content of other disciplines. But as we move towards the idea of integration of knowledge disciplines, the idea of multidimensionality of knowledge resulted in this idea that no knowledge discipline exists in hard silos, but that rather there is no hard silos and there is an integration across disciplines. And this is where, if the character of knowledge became integrated, if the character of knowledge is multidimensional, then can we afford to ignore that and continue with a silo-based degree educational system? So the idea of having hard demarcations between arts, science, commerce, and so on is completely blurring in the 21st century concept and understanding of knowledge. And that interconnectedness is what, as I said, resulted in the new notions of multidisciplinarity, which is where we have made out a very strong case for giving students curricular choices and so on. In the same fashion, learning, which is the other dimension of the education system, and which also was being seen as a sort of single dimension, or which was only having one aspect of it, which was the cognitive aspect, which is what we call as the learning to know, has got three other pillars of learning as per a UNESCO report, and we refer to four pillars of learning. Learning to know, which most of us are familiar with in a education system where we, in our classrooms, we are the ones who are the repositories of that knowledge, as is theoretical knowledge, conceptual knowledge, data, facts, information, and so on, which we pass on to the receivers who are the learners. And that was largely the transmission of cognitive knowledge and the knowledge dissemination, as we call it. So the learning to know remains the the most paramount pillar of learning. But in addition to that, you had other three pillars of learning in the 21st century, and that is learning to do, which is the skills or the experiential or the practical or the application of theory to real life situations, which has become the second dimension, which is the learning to do. The third pillar of learning is because we are living in a world of sustainable development, and therefore learning to live with others and to live together and to live with others, both these dimensions. The learning to live together and to live with others calls for these new ideas of global sustainable development and peace education, education for sustainable development, and so on, which was not there earlier, because the idea of promoting peace and compassion and tolerance and acceptance of diversity and agreeing to disagree, and that pluralities exist within societies, and we are all pluralistic societies, and that we should strive towards creating peace-driven societies rather than societies which are divided, resulting in war, resulting in strife, where learning cannot happen. So learning to live together and to live with others makes out a case not only for peaceful coexistence among individuals and nations and societies, but also for peaceful coexistence with other forms of nature which exist in this beautiful planet Earth, which is in terms of energy sources, water resources, climate, environment, forest, and so on. So that these sources of energy and so on continue to be replenished for future generations to be used, and therefore the idea of creating sustainable societies. And the last pillar of learning is learning to be, and which is really the foundation on which NEP is based. Learning to be is merely the recognition that the 60 odd people who are gathered over here in this virtual classroom are really very unique in terms of our potentials and our capabilities, and that every student, therefore, in a classroom situation is not a clone of another student, but rather is unique in terms of capabilities and attitudes and potentials and likes and dislikes and so on. And therefore, the need for individualization and customization, and a need to move away from structured systems of education to more flexible systems which allow students flexible options and choices and allow them to follow multiple pathways and trajectories. Coupled with these two dimensions, which is a major transformation, the third dimension or the third driver of change, which has forced the NEP to make the recommendations as it does, is the onset and the advent of what we call are the disruptive technologies. The name itself suggests that they have disrupted the way people work, people communicate, people travel, people bank, and so on. They've disrupted the normal ways in which we do that. And that is because artificial intelligence, robotics, and machine learning, and so on, have really transformed the way where machine intelligence is now dominating, and human intelligence is there as a tool to ensure that machine intelligence acts as per what human intelligence would want machines to do. But the threat of disruptive technologies is directly impacting the youth, and that is in terms of the jobs that will come about. So the conventional idea of learning, as it were, and the fact that you have disruptive technologies completely disrupting the kind of job profiles and leading to this new fears of future jobs being unknown and changing job profiles have resulted in the need for having an education system which will empower students with multiple skill sets and knowledge. Because ultimately, the primary stakeholder in an education system is the student. And we as the teachers are the catalysts to empower these students. And what are we empowering them with? We are empowering them with knowledge, skills, attitudes, capabilities, competencies, so that they become productive individuals, capable of leading to their own individual growth, to the societal development, to the economic growth, to the national growth and development, and become what we call 21st century global citizens. So if you have to do that, The students, the teachers, and the educational institutions must be aligned to the new requirements of knowledge, learning, and cope up with the challenges of disruptive technologies. So that is why the recommendations of NEP towards holistic and multidisciplinary education, towards the notions of multiple entry and exit, towards the notion that we should have teaching intensive universities and research intensive universities and so on, and to look at all dimensions of vocational education and open and distance learning, research on one side, entrepreneurship on the other side, emanates from this background. And therefore, whether we like it or not, we as teachers are going to be completely shaken out of our comfort zone. And that is where it is very important for us to embrace new notions in the way we do our teaching and learning, and also look at how we can become more empowered ourselves. Because when we are talking about multidisciplinarity, we need to shed our academic egos that my discipline is more important than another discipline, because all disciplines exist at a lateral level, contributing to an individual's holistic development. So the whole idea of holistic development calls for integration and amalgamation of disciplines coming together rather than disciplines excluding other disciplines, and looking at the need for multi-skilling and multiple knowledge exposures in our students. So this is the background, and you must have already had a series of talks on these various aspects of multidisciplinarity, and I'm now coming and confining myself to the topic of academic leadership, governance, and management. So as a starting statement, India has one of the largest higher education systems in the world. It's unchallenged because we have some 1,062 universities. These numbers are growing by the day. You have some 48 or 40,000 affiliated colleges. You have some 17,000 standalone institutions. You have 44 million students who are there as across all the streams. You have some 17 lakh faculty. And in terms of, therefore, the scope of our higher education, it is massive. But in order to understand academic leadership, as I said, it is not restricted to the idea of national education policy. National education policy is only trying to look at how the challenge of poor academic leadership needs to be addressed, and how leadership should be able to drive growth and change, so that you are adjusting yourself to the new requirements of a knowledge society. So the fact that we are a large higher education system, while it is a matter of strength, the challenge that lies before us is the quantity is directly seeming to be affecting the quality of higher education. And therefore, the fact that very few Indian higher education institutions feature in global rankings, the employability conversion of graduates getting jobs is not a very rosy picture. The fact that our learning outcomes of higher education students resulting in this ideas of their employability and so on is also not a very rosy picture, which asks us therefore to look at what are the challenges in higher education, because higher education institutions are very, very complex institutions. Let us understand, when you talk about governance and management, and when you talk about better governance and efficiency in governance and efficient management systems to be there in place, the first factor is the quality of the leader. And therefore, you need to understand what are those challenges that we are facing in higher education. So the large higher education system with equally concerns in terms of the quality is a major concern. Then comes the issue in terms of what are we teaching and where is the thrust coming into. So as I said, largely undergraduate education is focusing on dissemination of knowledge and not focusing much on new knowledge being created, or what we call knowledge generation or knowledge production. And therefore, our research productivity is absolutely at a very, very low level. not only the funding is low, it's just about 0.2% of the entire GDP. The productivity of research in terms of very good publications and very good patents being created is not very, I would not call that as a very positive factor. It is seen as one of the poor indicators of our higher education. So teaching, which itself I'll come to in a short while, is being sort of looked at in terms of very poor quality. And the fact that there is very little research happening actually puts the higher education system in our country, though it is a massive one, as one which is not really contributing to the world of knowledge generation so much. But what is equally concerning is that the organizational structure of higher education institutions, that itself, as I said, is complex. And that comes from the fact that we have a very fragmented higher education system. So it's a large system, but it's very fragmented. And why fragmented? It is fragmented because, firstly, you must understand that education is a subject in the concurrent list, and therefore both the government of India and the state governments have an equal role in not only the policy planning, but also the implementation. And largely, this aspect can come as both an opportunity as well as a challenge. It's an opportunity because you allow states the flexibility to choose their own ways in which they would like to have higher education. But the fact that they are in the state list also makes it that they may not subscribe to certain things that are laid down by the government of India. And therefore, this aspect of, let us say, lack of coordination may be a major challenge. But as I said, it is also an opportunity, and let us try and understand how both these things really function. So you have centrally funded institutions. They may be called as institutions of national importance. And in this whole array of 1,000 plus universities and institutions, they constitute a number which is a minuscule 150. They are central universities, they are IITs, they are IIMs, they are NITs, they are IIITs, they are ICERs, and there are many other institutions other than the Ministry of Education, dealing with shipping, dealing with petroleum, dealing with energy, and so many other areas, which all come under these institutions of national importance established by acts of the parliament. And therefore, they are getting funding directly from the ministry itself under which they come. Of course, the bulk of them largely come under the Ministry of Education, and the rest of them are spread out across 17 other ministries in the government of India. Then come your state universities, and 94% of higher education enrollment is in the state universities. But the funding that goes to them is a absolutely much lower level of funding than what goes into the central institutions. And the state institutions are, of course, having a geographical jurisdiction restricted to their own state. So that jurisdictional limitation is something that we need to see. Then you have, and these state universities are largely affiliating universities also. They are not unitary universities, which is the case of most of the centrally funded institutions. Then you have universities which are given a deemed university status, and then you have private universities that are there. So you can see that the entire structure of higher education is quite complex because it is fragmented. It is also fragmented by the disciplines it offers. Like there are colleges which only would offer arts and science, or they would be only commerce. So disciplinary fragmentation is also a reality which is seen as a major challenge in higher education. And it becomes a greater challenge when NEP is promoting the idea of multidisciplinarity, not for a fancy, as I said, but because that is the requirement of the future. And that is what is a knowledge society looking for, where you're breaking the disciplinary silos and you want institutions to become multidisciplinary. So the fragmentation across disciplines of engineering or management or pharmacy or agriculture or arts, science, commerce, and so on, or education, and so many others, all these actually add to the challenge of managing those institutions. And in the context of NEP, it becomes a limiting factor because they are not capable of really easily moving to become multidisciplinary. And here again, therefore, the role of a leader will be very, very significant. The other, as I said, is this huge gap between teaching and research on one end, and the fact that undergraduate education is hardly looking at the research part of it, which has resulted in very few higher education institutions, just then a single digit number of 3, 5, 7, 9. We have never crossed 10, which come into the global rankings, which is very, very sad as compared to the fact that you have about 1,100 universities. And you just take pride that, okay, this year more than 3, we are 5 or we are 7. And we think that that is a mark that we have made. It's not at all something that we should be feeling proud about. It is a fact that this is coming because of the disconnect between teaching and research, and which we have sought to remedy, or which we have sought to sort of rectify to a certain extent in the idea of the 4-year undergraduate program, where we are embedding research skills. We are talking about research internships, and we are talking about a 4th year of bachelor's with a thrust on research itself, so that we are trying to remove that kind of disconnect between teaching and research, and giving a lot of impetus to research at undergraduate education. And the other is the disconnect between pure education as we understand and skills. So the learning to do pillar, as I said, where there is a recognition for the need for skills and experiential learning, looks at actually merging education and skills. And education and skilling go hand in hand together. So we have embedded the idea of skill enhancement courses in the 4-year undergraduate program. We are promoting the idea of vocationalization of higher education, and the BVOC program also becoming multidisciplinary, because of the recognition that world over, you do not have two verticals of education and sales seen as disconnected, but rather being integrated together. As I said, 21st century, all ecosystems of learning is all of integration and amalgamation rather than one of exclusion of one to the other. And therefore, education and skills need to go hand in hand together. And children must have internships, as we have made it mandatory that all undergraduate education will have internships, because merely learning theory without understanding how it applies in the world of work is one of the reasons for that poor employability factor. And therefore, the employability skills, so-called graduate skills that we talk about, comes from having a skill exposure. And therefore, when you put in internships, you actually bridge the gap to a great extent between education and skills. So we are talking in terms of this being very critical. And on the higher side, we are also talking in terms of creating job creators. And that is where entrepreneurial education comes in, through this whole idea of enterprise education, startups and incubation centers, and the whole idea that individuals can create enterprises from an idea that is there as a thought, which then takes the form of a product and which then can be marketed and therefore yield revenue. That whole chain that you're looking at, from ideation to productization and marketization, comes in through entrepreneurial education. And that is what higher education should also look at. Then the challenge that comes in is the fact that India is a pluralistic country, and equity and inclusion and social disparities and economic disparities and regional disparities greatly affect the manner in which our institutions address these disparities. The idea is to remove the disparities and to provide greater access, ensure equity and inclusion, so that all cross sections of the society have an equal right and a greater opportunity for participation in both school education and in higher education. So when you look at a quantitative target of the gross enrollment ratio, which the NEP has stated as 50% to be achieved by 2035, it is important that we include the SCDGs, who are the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, the OBCs, the minorities, girls, transgenders, children with disabilities, physical and learning disabilities, urban poor, vulnerable sections like children from the migrant family. All of them have to be given an enabling ecosystem for greater participation, and their specific interventions would be necessary and specific strategies to enhance their educational participation. As we wrote in the NEP, special education zones, gender inclusion fund, social inclusion fund, offering higher education in regional languages. These are all game changers that we are looking at. And the fact that this is very, very important, because you cannot have sustained growth unless all cross sections have an equal participation rate in higher education. So the minimizing of regional, social, economic disparities within higher education institutions becomes very critical to the idea of the goals of access, equity, inclusion, affordability, and so on. And this is again, as I said, a major challenge that we have to deal with. Then coming to the quality of teaching. So one of the, and as someone who's been in the government, let me be very upfront with you that most of the bureaucratic setups believe that India doesn't fare well is because we have very poor quality teaching happening. And therefore, the first person they're willing to hang by the noose is the teacher. And I've heard those statements across my 14 years in the government of India. And as a teacher, have been trying, as Sajid had mentioned, all those initiatives of capacity building and leadership development and training that we need to provide emanates from that thought that teachers, if you're talking that is poor quality teaching, and you're directly criticizing that because of the poor quality of teachers, then teachers must be given capacity building, and therefore their professional development must be a major felt need, and that has to continuously happen. So training, retraining, and orientation and sensitization and refresher courses, this has to be an ongoing exercise for the continuous professional development of teachers. Also creating all those teaching learning resources, ensuring that teachers have been trained to use technology in a very efficient manner. The whole idea, therefore, of poor quality of teaching needs to be addressed, not from the point of view of merely taking a critical view of it, but in terms of understanding that if teachers have to improve their quality of teaching, there has to be professional development, training, and a lot of career development incentivization that happens, and an ecosystem where enablers are provided, where teachers have all the infrastructure, good classrooms, good amenities, good content that is allowed to be used, the curricula can be, and autonomy being given to the teacher. So while the NEP recognizes the criticality of teachers, it has also made out a very strong case for their career growth and their professional development, and also talked about leadership development, which I'll come to in a short while from now. So this whole idea that poor quality teaching has to be addressed has also made us move in the direction of outcome-based education. And therefore, this whole idea of learning outcomes and course outcomes and program outcomes that are very, very critical to ensuring that students acquire the kind of knowledge, skills, and competencies that results in getting that kind of skills that translate into outcomes in their future life and in their future trajectory or career as they go along. So the whole shift from input-based education to outcome-based education, and therefore the changing role of a teacher from one who is just a knowledge giver to be a facilitator and an enabler and a motivator and a mentor, all these come into play in this new changing paradigm that we are looking at towards outcome-based education. We also emphasize that higher education institutions suffer from poor leadership, very inefficient governance and management structures. So the challenge of that is where we are talking about today on the topic of academic leadership, and that all academic leadership must come not from the bureaucracy, not from the industry, not from people who are not connected to the academia, but leadership of higher education institutions must be teachers and faculty who go on as a part of their career development to become the academic leaders in the positions of directors, HODs, deans, pro-vice chancellors and then vice chancellors and so on. So the career growth of a faculty is the one that leads to the leadership position, and therefore the emphasis on academic leadership becomes very, very critical, because that also affects to a great extent the kind of governance structures and the management procedures and processes that we put into place. So this whole area needs a lot of attention, and this is where that professionalism comes into higher education. So a major criticism of Indian higher education is the lack of professionalism in our higher education institutions. And what do we mean by professionalism? When we talk about professionalizing a particular sector, it means you have standard procedures, you have some certain protocols in place, you have certain the people who meet that are those who are merit based, and there is a certain degree of transparency and accountability, probity and public accountability and so on. So the notions of autonomy and accountability, all that is the other dimension of it. So higher education institutions actually are autonomous institutions, and we also grant autonomy to institutions where they can have their own academic curriculum to a great extent and have their own admission criteria, even conduct their own examinations and so on. These freedoms that we give in the name of autonomy, to a certain degree, insulates them from a great degree of governmental accountability. But the reality is that our higher education institutions are quite frightened of the word autonomy, because the major factor is that we are used to receiving funds, and we can never think of our institutions becoming self-sustaining. It is one of the grayest areas of our inability to leverage funds in higher education. All funding that we look at is what is coming to us from the government, and government grants will not come the way it has been continuously coming, because that is a phenomenon that institutions must become self-sustaining. So many initiatives we start with have a certain lifespan, 5 years, 10 years, and then that institution has to fund it itself. So the institutions don't want autonomy, because when you say autonomy, it means you're being left off from the host institution, and grants which have been coming in are going to stop, because it's academic autonomy, administrative autonomy, and financial autonomy. So one likes the freedom without the responsibility, which is a normal human phenomenon, and that is there even in our HEIs, where they would not like to actually lose out on the controls, because they don't mind the control, because that control is enabling them to get the funds. Whereas a more matured higher education system will be one where institutions actually try to leverage that autonomy to get in new courses, to have the freedom to innovate, they have the freedom to make out new initiatives and come out in various ways to meet with the new requirements of a knowledge economy, whereas that they are not very keen on, because that would mean that the degree of funding would get reduced. And therefore, this huge tussle that we have between autonomy and accountability of higher education institutions is something that we really need to look head on and understand that autonomy is a stage of evolving, and that all higher education institutions should really try and strive to become autonomous while having a minimum degree of accountability, which is public accountability, transparencies in the way of functioning, and so on. Then coming to the challenge of technology. None of us can ignore the fact that technology is all permeating today, and our higher education institutions cannot remain insulated from this development that is happening. Not only it is the integration of technology, but as I said, new technologies that are coming and new models of learning. So the whole idea of technology integrated learning has resulted in online education, blended modes of learning, hybrid models of learning, and so on. And this is also being used in terms of governance, internal governance, maintenance of data, and ensuring that the ease of doing business is there by using technology and it is easier for to have systems in place using technology, so that the human part of it gets reduced, and the time and the energy that we spend in that can be reduced because of the use of technology. So integration of technology for teaching purposes, for new models of teaching, for administrative and e-governance, if we may say so, and for maintenance of data is also is both, as I said, an opportunity for us to make our institutions very unique by that nature. And when you stretch that further, you have online education and ODL systems leading to the idea of digital universities and virtual universities and so on. So this is the landscape within which we are talking in the NEP about the idea of academic leadership. And as I said, it is very, very critical for us to understand that it is teachers who should become academic leaders. So the NEP has, in very clear, unambiguous terms, specified that leadership of academic institutions must be teachers and faculty who come in through leadership development programs and move on to take up leadership positions. And therefore, we talk about leadership development at assistant professor level, associate professor level, and at professor level. So the LEAP program was one where we had it for the professor level who were going to become future directors of institutions or vice chancellors or pro vice chancellors. The idea was to keep out industry and to keep out the bureaucracy from taking on these leadership positions. And even in such private universities and colleges which are headed by private management, even if it is by a family, the positions of academic, of vice chancellor and so on, must not go to family people unless they fulfill all the eligibility to take on that position. So the idea of merit and meritocracy being very, very critical, even in private universities, which we know exist, is highlighted in the policy. But when we talk about academic leadership in the policy, we accept the fact that teachers have to become that. We also say that training has to be provided, career opportunities must be provided for their growth, and professional development of faculty to take up leadership positions through continuous leadership development programs must be a regular feature of all higher education institutions. And for that, obviously, the regulatory systems like the UGC, the AICTE, the NCTE, the Pharmacy Council, the Council of Architecture, all of that, the 17 councils that we have, must address this requirement so that it is teachers and faculty who are made to evolve to become the academic leaders. Now, once you're there as an academic leader, what are the certain qualities that academic leaders must possess? First and foremost, one of the handicaps we are seeing is an academic leader has got the disciplinary knowledge because he or she is a faculty of a given discipline. And therefore, their disciplinary strength is there. But once they become a leader, they don many other hats. They are also an administrative head. They also need to understand financial rules and regulations and so on. So when you talk about an academic leader, as an institution, what are those qualities that a leader must be able to command? Firstly is the ability to have a vision and a strategy. All your higher education institutions from where you come, you will go back to your institution's website and you will see that there is a vision statement and a mission statement and clear-cut goals and objectives. You have not done that. You've just done your job of going and teaching your subject. You need to revisit that and have a look at your website and identify what your institution to which you are attached as a faculty is proclaiming as its vision and a mission statement and its goals and objectives. So as a leader, the leader must be able to revisit that vision and mission, because as per the NEP requirements, you need to, not only the NEP, the changing requirements, these are not to be frozen in point of time. A college or a university set up in 1950 and which is now there and continuing to be there cannot have a vision that was there in 1950s, the same being projected in 2024. The vision and the mission is a dynamic statement. and it has to completely keep changing. So the visioning and the strategizing, what are the goals? What are the strategies to achieve those goals must be continuously done. And for that, in the policy, we wrote about a beautiful document that every higher education institution must be making, which is more for a governance, and that is the institutional development plan. But as a quality, a leader must have a vision and a strategy in mind, and these strategy must have identified milestones with timelines to be achieved. The second is the fact that as a leader, the person should have people management skills. As I said, higher education institutions are very complex enterprises. And when you deal with the kind of stakeholders, unlike business corporations and corporate houses, where either you have employees and you have only the management, here you have students, you have teachers, you have parents, you have non-teaching staff, you have technical staff, you have then the administrative staff, and then the leaders and the management side of it. So there are multiple people sets in a higher education institution, and you can have conflicts between any of these sections that are there, because conflicts arise in response to certain things that are happening. Therefore, how do you have good people management skills to eliminate and reduce conflicts? Because any conflicts that happen, whether it's a student strike or a teacher strike or any kind of a student suicide or any kind of a aberration in behavior, results and directly impacts the quality of that institution and the way it has got to tackle that crisis on hand. So people management skills is one of the qualities that a leader must have. Then becoming a leader, as I said, administrative management, knowing the rules and regulations. Now we don't want a vice chancellor or an HOD or a dean to know all the nitty gritty, but at least there should be an understanding of the broad administrative rules and regulations and the procedures. Same is true for financial management. So the next one would be understanding the financial rules and regulations and what is doable, what is not doable, what are the do's and don'ts, what are the statutory requirements, how is it that auditing takes place, how is it that budgeting takes place. These basic understanding has to be there. Since the person is a leader in an academic institution, the main concern obviously is the quality of teaching. And therefore, in the context of NEP and the need to move towards multidisciplinarity, the leaders of higher education institutions must try and find out how teaching is more in terms of the requirements of 21st century of multidisciplinarity, of embedding many other activities in a teaching ecosystem and so on. And also empowering teachers so that effective teaching is there, outcome-based education is there. The next is research and skilling, that I said, two parts of it. Both need to be looked at in that dimension. And how does a higher education institution promote research and so on, has to be also seen from that angle. And also skilling that is needed in higher education institutions. So the qualities that promote good teaching, good research, integrating skills, looking at integrating technology when providing all kinds of education, whether it's online education, hybrid model, blended model, all those models have to be explored by the leaders. Then coming to equity and inclusion and student support. Your primary stakeholder is the student. How do you address student support for academic support, for socio-emotional support, for their physical development? We are talking about the higher education multidisciplinarity, integrating sports and wellness, creative aspects of dancing and dramatics and so on. So this whole aspect of providing avenues for optimal development of students across various sectors is another dimension. And along with that, the career counseling, the academic support, the psychological counseling, because today there are a lot of student suicides arising from student stress, and looking at the disparities and ensuring that there is equity and inclusion and student grievance redressal. So this entire gamut comes under the need for student support, equity and inclusion, grievance redressal, socio-emotional well-being, all these aspects which come under student support. In the context today, you're also looking at collaboration. Collaboration for purposes across institutions for it to become multidisciplinary, collaboration for research, and collaboration as a part of internationalization of higher education. So this is another new dimension of higher education, and a leader must be very, very aligned to these new requirements, because no longer higher education institutions can work as an independent unit. That idea is lost. That idea is irrelevant today. It has completely become irrelevant today. You must have departments which collaborate, institutions that collaborate with academia, with industry, collaborate with research institutions, collaborate with other institutions in other countries, and come out with joint degrees, dual degrees, and so on. So the role of a leader today in a higher education institution is to look at a number of these almost 10 qualities that I said, covering 10 areas, so that they are able to address all the requirements of a higher education institution while ensuring a very effective management of the higher education system. Now, I'm not going to talk about regulation, but I'll give you an idea of regulation. But before that, coming to internal governance and management, we in the policy wrote about, as I said earlier, a document that we called as the Institutional Development Plan. And what is that? It is merely a strategic plan of action that every college, every university, every institution must prepare. And all it does is to put all stakeholders, because it's a collegiate exercise, where where representatives of teachers, students, parents, senior faculty, senior management, civil society, industry, academicians, scientists in that area, local community people, all of them are represented in a task force which will prepare this document, which is a plan of action looking at where you would like your institution going forward in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. So NEP said we can have higher education institutions which are teaching intensive universities or research intensive universities, and to bring about a major reform in affiliation, we said that we would like affiliated colleges to move towards becoming degree granting autonomous colleges. Now, please understand, when we wrote that in the policy, and when we say that we have 40,000 affiliated colleges, we will not have 40,000 degree granting colleges. There will be a kind of a rationalization and a calibration among the institutions, where some of them may amalgamate with other colleges to become a cluster university, or they will become a part and parcel of a university, and some of them will move to become degree granting autonomous college. But there is a complete restructuring of the higher education institutions, and in this IDP, it is not prepared by an external agency. It is not prepared by the government. It is prepared by us as stakeholders within that institution, where we are doing a brainstorming and revisiting our own vision and mission statements and working out a plan of action for the coming 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And it's a living document, not something that you make and put it into a shelf somewhere and forget about it altogether. Yes, we have made an IDP and that is there over there in the shelf of a particular official or a certain dean or director or so on. It is supposed to be a document which is a living document, where you do a SWOT analysis, where you identify for your institution what are its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, challenges, or threats, and address those sort of opportunities and threats and challenges, and move towards a direction of growth in terms of larger strategic goals. The goals can be in the buckets of access or equity or quality or research and autonomy and so on. It can have those, and then you identify what are the key milestones through identified performance indicators. It's an exercise to be done. Since everybody cannot be involved in that, there has to be a task force, which is all, as I said, representatives of all these cross sections. And this document is then vetted by all others whom they represent, revised and iterated once and again, over and over again, so that you have that put up in public domain for people to know and to keep monitoring that whether you reached it or not, what are the bottlenecks. And therefore that whole exercise has timelines, has budgets, has targets, and qualitative parameters that you need to keep achieving. This exercise, as I said, has to take place on a regular, has to take place with a very focused approach. The UGC guidelines that initially came out was not one which I would have recommended, but the recent one, which is a very crisp document, is one which you should. And you need not say, in what way am I connected with that? You must, as an educator, feel the need to understand what is an IDP and how it is done. And wherever you get an opportunity to be a part of that exercise, please take up that opportunity, because you have not done it, but it is an exposure, and that is a kind of a training that prepares you for leadership positions. Now, coming to internal governance, you know that all our colleges and universities have a multiple set of bodies. Either it is called a board of governors or an executive council or a senate. Then you have your academic council, the finance committee, the court, so many bodies that are created. You have research committees and research councils, and these bodies, while they are there for the purposes that are created and for prevention of, let us say, sexual harassment and prevention of atrocities against the SCDGs, so many of these committees are there. We still felt that over and above all this, you must have a very empowered body, which we would like to call the empowered board of governors. And that body is, again, as we said, a very collegiate body, where you must have teacher representatives, student representatives, parent representatives, civil society members, educationists, scientists, and so on, people from the local community, because you are, as a higher education institution, not insulated from the community within which you are situated. All higher education institutions have one major role of enhancing the quality of life and the well-being of people that live in a certain community. It's a thought that we have completely ignored and look at it from only our discipline and completely forgotten the larger purpose of higher education. And therefore, this empowered body that we are talking about as an empowered board of governors actually will bring that community connect. That is the third function of higher education, which is of social responsibility and social commitment, and also the connect that we want HEIs to bring with school education. The policy has made out the need to understand that education happens in an organic continuum, and there is no disconnect between secondary education and higher education. So how do you bring that connect? How do you bring the connect with research institutions? How do you bring the connect with industry? How do you bring out linkages with many other factors which are contributing to a knowledge economy? And how do you bring a connect with the community? So extension activities and those kind of activities, not just the typical NSS and NCC, which is all outdated and doing things for tokenism, but really making a change for the betterment of the community around, looking at problems relating to energy, looking at water, looking at sanitation. These are all our social responsibilities. So this part of it will also come into the play through having this kind of empowered board of governors. Now, I'll just stop with regulation because the time does not permit, and neither does this topic lend itself to that. But in the context of governance, you must also understand technology's role, which I already mentioned about, but external regulation that we talk about in terms of regulation, funding, accreditation, and standard setting. In our country, we've had this idea of having too much of concentration in our regulatory bodies. So the UGC Act of 1956, when we were only 50 universities, looked at all these functions of regulation, accreditation, funding, and standard setting. But it is neither desirable that all the four functions remain in the same body. One, it results in an over-concentration of power. Two, it results in conflicts of interest. And therefore, in the policy, we wrote about a light but tight regulation in separating these four functions of regulation, which is to come under the National Higher Education Regulatory Council, of assessment and accreditation to come under the newly created National Accreditation Council. Then the third, for funding, since UGC and AICT will all become null and void if the regulatory reform takes place, HEGC for the higher education funding, and a General Education Council along with professional standard setting bodies to take care of academic standard setting. And this whole 4 different verticals will come under an umbrella structure that we call the Higher Education Commission of India. This was to be a legislation which should have been brought out in the parliament. Though announced by the Honorable Finance Minister in 2 budget speeches, it has not seen the light of the day, and it is unlikely to see the light of the day until the new set of government comes into power. So until then, the UGC, AICT, NCT, Medical Council of India, the National Medical Council, the Bar Council, all of them continue in their conventional roles. But you are seeing a change because most of these bodies are now looking at how to align their courses to the new requirements of NEP. So the Council of Architecture is doing it, Pharmacy Council is doing it, the National Medical Council is doing it, the Bar Council is doing it. They're all making their courses multidisciplinary. But as far as that regulatory reform is concerned, that has still not come into play. And that is because consensus building in a country like ours, talking to the states, making them convinced about this reform, being in the betterment, is something which is very, very difficult to achieve. So overall, as educators and trying to understand these dimensions, don't think that today I am only an assistant professor or an associate professor. In what way I am being connected to all these aspects? You must always have a aspiration to move towards newer roles. And you are the ones who have the only career growth you have is these kind of opportunities. And therefore, the need to move towards that direction requires you to get empowered through leadership development programs. And there are, the NEP has given you an enabling ecosystem for that. The role of the teacher is getting transformed. And we are talking about instrumentalities like the institutional development plan, creation of new bodies. Wherever such opportunities come about, please feel more proactive to be a part of that exercise. So NEP, in a certain sense, talks about transformative reforms. Transformative reforms cannot take place unless you have very far-sighted academic leaders, good governance structures, good management practices, and that is what we have tried to understand in our talk today. I'll stop over here and keep the remaining time for interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Please unmute yourself and interact. It may not necessarily be a question, but as people who are teaching in colleges and universities, I'm sure you have independent thoughts of your own. And I would like to really see some views coming from the faculty here. I would also like to say that you need not restrict yourself to academic leadership. Please feel free to talk on any aspect of NEP. Share your thoughts. Let us make it interactive. If you are not interactive, it is very unlikely that you will be interactive in your classrooms, in which case that you are the one who will be talking single-handed, not allowing your students to participate. I don't want to go with that feedback in my mind.
Madam,
Yes, please.
how the
Please introduce yourself. Who are you and what you do?
myself Devakumar Burua from Lakhimpur.
What do you
How
teach?
lateral entry? Yes, madam.
What do you teach?
I teach statistics.
Okay.
How does the lateral entry from engineering to general course and general course to some other courses can be conducted?
So we are introducing reforms in school education where we are removing at the middle stage. I'm sure all of you have heard that we are talking about the 5+3+3+4 curricular restructuring, where we are talking in the middle stage between 11 to 14 and the secondary stage 14 to 18, that students will no longer have hard separations of arts, science, vocational, academic, and that students will study across 8 curricular areas relating to maths education, science education, social science education, language education, physical education and sports, arts education, vocational education, and interdisciplinary areas. So our conventional mindset in the way we undertook education, that students will exclusively study to the exclusion of other subjects, is completely being removed right from school education. And in secondary education also, this is the approach. But meanwhile, since we cannot wait till it is implemented in school and then go on to higher, we have introduced the idea of multidisciplinarity right in higher education itself. And we have created the National Credit Framework, where we have indicated that those who come in from, let us say, engineering or polytechnic education should be given the benefit of a certain credit level that they have acquired, and allow them to join the mainstream higher education. So let us say, for example, that joining an ITI with a minimum requirement of class 8, and the student did an ITI level, should be allowing that student to complete and join the secondary stage education of class 11 and 12. Similarly, a polytechnic student who has completed, let us say, a diploma after class 10 should be allowed to join the second year of the degree program. So this kind of a credit mobility has been done through the National Credit Framework. And this would therefore allow the seamless kind of lateral entry and exit. So our mindset that only a student of physics can go to engineering is completely changed now, because in the IIT exams, the AICTE and the NTA and all have removed this requirement that only certain subjects which are covered, your traditional PCB and your PCM and so on, that is being completely changed, because other subjects weightages are also being given equal importance. So this is, of course, requiring us, because we are used to a very structured system. And that is why I often tell that if you want to be an effective teacher, you remove your bias of having come from single discipline based education and structured systems to understanding that knowledge disciplines no longer exist in silos. But the fundamentals must be known. Therefore, if a student who has not learned, let us say, physics from, let us say, the middle stage or at least the secondary stage onwards in 9, 10, 11, and 12, and then wants to take up in the bachelor's degree physics as a course, it is important that we sensitize that student to understand that if you do not know the fundamentals, taking physics might be a big drawback for you, because you may not be knowing the basics and the foundations of it. Therefore, your taking physics is difficult. So in this way, we need to make them. But suppose a student is insistent that no, I was very good at science, and therefore up to my class 8 I have studied science. At that time we did not have the demarcations of physics and chemistry and so on, so I'm good at science and therefore I can do it well. Then such students, we should be able to encourage them to do bridge courses and still allow them to take up physics if they want to take it up in their degree programs. I don't know whether I've convinced you about that, but all the instrumentalities in terms of the National Credit Framework, the idea of bridge courses, and the idea that from school education we will have students getting exposed to all the major 8 and 9 areas, and they will choose subjects in that combination where they will have a modicum of understanding of social sciences, with physical education, with arts education, with vocational education. These have now been embedded into the higher education system.
Thank you, madam.
Any other question or thought, or please share even your thoughts. Don't feel uncomfortable about it.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is
Good
Dr.
afternoon.
Aman Azim. I'm
Yeah.
speaking from Aligarh Muslim University's center there in West Bengal. Ma'am, I just want to confirm or my doubt that national education policy talks about all the spheres that are needed to be covered. Na? Ma'am, what is the feasibility at ground level of this NEP, ma'am?
So the feasibility, we have not said, and it is not desirable that we have a one-size-fits-all model for the entire country. Higher education institutions are located in the areas within which they function. So let us assume that there is an arts college and we want to have multidisciplinarity, which is requiring that students take up subjects of science or commerce and so on. We have said that institutions can collaborate and create through a memorandum of agreement or understanding an arrangement to make multidisciplinarity a reality. So while we say that we want multidisciplinarity, and there are limitations that we are a fragmented higher education system, which I said was one of the reasons why India does not feature in global rankings, that we confine ourselves to either arts or science or commerce. But since we are still a growing nation, we still think that this is a developmental requirement and we may start offering other disciplines. But till that happens, until we have comprehensive higher education institutions, AMU is a comprehensive university, BHU is a comprehensive university, you have Jadavpur University, which is a comprehensive university, you have Jamia, all of these are comprehensive, Delhi University, Pune University, Bombay University. These are all comprehensive universities where you have colleges offering various disciplines. But till that happens, we want institutions to start collaborating. Unfortunately, as faculty, we do not like to collaborate with other faculty, forget anything else. We will not collaborate even with our colleagues. That's how our mindset has been made. And that is the tragedy of our higher education system. So we have to really start unshackling and unbundling our biases. That individuals collaborate, departments collaborate, institutions collaborate. So the feasibility that seems very large arises from our inbuilt bias that it is me and my institution alone or my department alone. And here NEP is talking about multidisciplinarity. This is where the dilemma is coming. And this is where it appears that it is impossible to think in terms of offering multidisciplinarity. So the UGC guidelines have clearly specified how to transform institutions into multidisciplinary institutions. Now, even within an institution like AMU, you must have departments that come together. And therefore, when we talk of multidisciplinarity, the meetings that will have to take place to make it real is all departments being represented to bring forward this idea of multidisciplinarity. So the curriculum planning would require all departments to start talking with one another, not just talking to one another, but talking with other departments. This is where the feasibility appears a challenge. And this is where, if we as faculty must understand that our students cannot come out with degrees only in one single discipline, they will be staring at a future that they are likely to remain unemployed, because today's graduate is expected to be a T-shaped graduate and not an I-shaped graduate. You and I are I-shaped graduates, where we had single disciplinary depth, and no longer graduates who are I-shaped will have any employment prospects, because the multiple skill sets, multiple knowledge exposures is a reality for their employability. And therefore, if we have to be really effective teachers, we must come out of our biases that we want our students to be single discipline exposed to becoming T-shaped graduates. I give up my disciplinary ego. I talk to other departments. Our institutions talk to other institutions, so that the feasibility, which appears to be a challenge, is really not a challenge, It is our own limited ways of looking at education and not understanding that if you want students, they acquire higher education not because it is an esoteric or an intangible benefit. It has a direct tangible benefit in terms of its employability factor. While I'm not making out a case, because I don't believe the limited role of higher education is only for employment. In developing countries, it is so even now, but you have a larger idea to make a knowledgeable person. But the fact remains that if they want employment and if they continue with single discipline, the likelihood of their getting jobs is very, very limited. And if that is what we don't want as teachers, then we must not be affected by what seemingly appears as challenges because of our biases, because of our own ways in which we were educated. Because when we were educated, we did not have multidimensionality of knowledge, we did not have multidimensionality of learning, we did not have the threat of disruptive technologies. So you are preparing students to become future ready. Then you must be able to move towards that. But as I said, all institutions in India need not offer all the courses that are there. What is viable in a given context, to that limited extent, the multidisciplinarity can be explored, and that has to be explored if you don't want your students to remain unemployed and become, let us say, not a demographic dividend, but to become a demographic disaster. The moment a student coming out with a degree is unemployed, then that is an unproductive youth, and that is really a social burden, an economic burden, and therefore a liability rather than a leveraging potential for the youth power.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your expert opinion and advice. Thank you very much. It was really helpful, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Please come forward. Please feel free to ask or share your thoughts, even in Hindi. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat box, but I'm looking forward to some interaction, please. No more questions? I don't know if anyone is there from AMU, but if there are no more questions, I would just close the session from my end. Let me know from your side, from the participant side, if there is anyone who wants to ask questions, or if anyone is there from AMU, because I'm going to wind up the session. There's no point in keeping a virtual classroom open if there is no interaction that is happening. Okay, so if there are no questions, thank you very much for being a part of it. Please go through the NEP guidelines that the UGC has been bringing out. Don't confine yourselves to just understanding the discipline that you were teaching, because you have a much larger role as an educator to really empower the students and see that they become employable graduates. And therefore, in that role, please try to take up a very proactive role and also work for your own career development through leadership development programs. Thank you very much. Stay blessed and take care.